Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, good afternoon. Season 7 will guide us into the cultural, theological, and editorial background of the Conciliar Declaration Nostra Aetate. My name is Jan Mikrut. I am professor of church history at the Gregorian University and a priest of the Archdiocese of Vienna in Austria. One of my research priorities is the history of the Second World War, National Socialism and Communism in the Central and Eastern Europe. In a friendly conversation many years ago, Cardinal Franz König, former Archbishop Emeritus of Vienna, explained me about his participation at the Second Vatican Council and about the difficulties he faced with the conciliar decision. In particular, Cardinal König pointed out the resistance to Pope John XXIII's desire for a special conciliar declaration on Judaism. The opposition came from the Arab countries and their churches. The Conciliar Commission was of the opinion that the issue should not be discussed at the Council but only later. But Cardinal Beer and Pope John XXIII insisted on it, and the Catholic Church celebrates exactly today the liturgical commemoration of Pope St. John XXIII. Thanks largely to Cardinal Beer that Nostra Aetate could be approved in October 1965. Cardinal König reminded me on this occasion that Nostra Aetate was one of the shortest documents of the Council, but also one of the most important. The decisive turning point in relation between the Catholic Church and Judaism and about Nostra Aetate was underled by Pope John Paul II during his historical visit to the Roman synagogue on Sunday, 13 April 1986. The Pope's first ever visit in the synagogue was an extraordinary event where milestones in the reconciliation between Judaism and the Catholic Church. The oldest Jewish diaspora communities in Europe was very happy at the Pope's visit and his historical significance. But the 2,000 years of most difficult Jewish history cannot be erased from one day to the next. It is a continuing process that everyone must work on. I now give the floor today, first speaker, Sister Celia Deutsch. The title of her presentation is Theological Journey of Notre Dame de Sion, from Conversion to Dialogue. Dr. Celia Deutsch is sister of the Notre Dame de Sion and research scholar in the Religion Department at Barnard College, Columbia University, and teaches at Holy Trinity College, Harare in Zimbabwe. Dr. Deutsch writes in the fields of early Judaism and early Christianity. She is a member of the Society of Biblical Literature, the Catholic Biblical Association, the Theology Committee of the International Council of Christians and Jews, and the Council of Centers of Jewish-Christian Relations. She serves on the Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs Commission of the Diocese of Brooklyn. Sister Celia Deutsch, please present your topic.
Good afternoon. I first want to say thank you to all of the organizers for the splendid work that has made this conference, this very important conference, possible. And I would also like to say a big thank you for the gift of an invitation to present my work. Accounts of Nostra Aetate most often focus on a small group of Catholic and Jewish leaders, Shirlisak, Pope John the 23rd, Augustine Cardinal Bea, Monsignor John Osterreicher, Dr. Joseph Lichten, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. However, this document was due directly and indirectly to the work of a much broader and larger cast of people, working in collaboration over decades, beginning with the turn of the 20th century. Notre Dame de Sion was part of that effort. This paper will focus especially on the theological evolution of the congregation between 1945 and 1965, the year of the promulgation of Nostra Aetate. This is a story of a journey. It lurches, it takes wrong turns sometimes. It begins, it stops, it begins again. It's a story in which Roman Catholic priests and sisters and their affiliates prayed for the conversion of the Jews and worked to engage others in this project. Proselytism was forbidden, very strictly forbidden, but Notre Dame de Sion shared the conversionist principles of the Catholic Church before the Second Vatican Council. There are two words that have always come to me as I do this work. One is ambivalence. This process it held conflicting opinions and conflicting perspectives in tandem, lurching along. And the other word is friendship. It is a work of friendship, people working together in their differences, and sometimes in their conflicting differences, in respect over the years, sometimes risking their lives for one another. I will discuss very briefly some 5 elements that led to that transformation. The life of Theodore Ratisbonne, our founder, the movement of philosemitisme, ressourcement, the Shoah, and finally, the Finale affair. The founder of Notre Dame de Sion, Theodore Ratisbonne, was born in Strasbourg in 1802 into a wealthy Jewish family 2 generations out of the ghetto, on its way to assimilation, yet with strong ties and deep commitments to the Jewish community of Strasbourg. He himself had a rocky teenage period and early adult period. A chance meeting with a previously unknown colleague at the university, Jules Level, brought the invitation to join a small study circle led by the philosopher Louis Bottin and inspired and guided by Louise Urman, an educator. As a young adult, Theodore's life became increasingly unsettled, and yet he was drawn inexorably towards Christianity, even though Louise herself had counseled him to become a good Jew, meaning go to the synagogue. Theodore was baptized by Louise Urman on April the 14th, 1827, Holy Saturday evening. Events devolved. He himself and his companions began preparing for ordination. Theodore was ordained in 1830. Events devolved, and he found himself eventually in Paris, working as chaplain at a girls' orphanage and serving at the Church of Notre Dame des Victoires, where he acquired a reputation for preaching that spread throughout France and Germany. In 1842, his brother Alphonse visited Rome, and during that visit stopped briefly in the Church of Sant'Andrea delle Ferrate. There he had a mystical experience in which he saw Mary. He emerged from that experience a convinced Christian and began to encourage Theodore to work for the conversion of the Jews. Theodore always said that he waited for the signs of providence in all matters that were important. He asked for a sign, and by the day's end had received an answer. A dying Jewish mother asked that her 2 children be cared for and raised as Christians. Soon there was a whole group of such children. This is mid-19th century France, okay? A place in which the Jewish community was predominantly very, very poor, especially in some of the cities. Theodore needed help in caring for these children, and so he called on several women in Strasbourg whom he had served as spiritual director. They became the first Sisters of Sion eventually. He wasn't asking them to be sisters. He did not want to found a religious order. They wanted to be a religious community. Their daily life and their daily prayer, communal prayer, included prayers for the conversion of the Jews. After several years, parents of Gentile Christian children began asking Theodore and the women to receive their daughters into the school to be educated. And so that's how we see the beginning of a network, an international network of schools of Notre Dame de Sion. These were places and are places where children of all faiths are educated. Soon, this community went, in the 1850s, we went to what is now Israel, to Jerusalem. There were children, Roman Catholic children were the small minority in a lot of our schools. There were Orthodox Christians, there were Muslims, there were Jews, and there were some Roman Catholics. Children were never obliged to attend Catholic religious instruction. They were also, when possible, taken to synagogues, mosques, or appropriate churches for regular services. And where possible, when it was geographically possible, the sisters sought the aid of rabbis or imams or Protestant ministers to give appropriate religious instruction to the children. And yet, and this is where the motif of ambivalence shows, the schools were seen as ways of introducing students and their parents to praying for the conversion of the Jews. A small group of men gathered in 1852 and became the first male religious of Our Lady of Sion, or the Fathers of Sion, as they're sometimes called. Theodore and those early women and men of Sion were imbued with a sense of mission to pray for the conversion of the Jews. Theodore's writings bear evidence of the theological anti-Judaism/anti-Semitism so prevalent in Christian theology until prior to the mid-20th century. And yet, the sense of relationship, of respect for the conscience of persons, and the adamant prohibition against proselytism were, I think, seeds to the path of dialogue. Philosemitism. I'm using this word not as is usually understood currently in the United States as a kind of appreciation of Judaism that can lead to an appropriation of Jewish ritual. Rather, I'm using it in the sense of Olivier Rota, who says that it is a spiritual, theological, and social political perspective that originated towards the end of the 19th century in France, partly in response or reaction to the Dreyfus affair. Those engaged in philosemitic discourse shared the supersessionist theology of the classical Christian thinking, without, however, engaging in racial anti-Semitism or discrimination. In 1905, Notre Dame de Sion founded the Archconfraternity of Prayer for Israel to seek the Jews' conversion through prayer and to gather people together for lectures, prayer, and conversations. This organization spread throughout Europe, Great Britain, and North America. The official publication was Annales de la Mission de Notre Dame de Sion en Terre Sainte, often abbreviated as Annales de Terre Sainte. There one finds traditional substitution and supersessionist theology characterized by such claims as the church is the new Israel. However, the discovery, more ambivalence, the discovery of the Jewishness of Jesus and Mary and the first Christians, as well as an ongoing reflection on Romans 9-11, created another kind of discourse, that of continuity. Théomire de Vaux, Father Théomire de Vaux, was elected Superior General of the Fathers of Sion in 1925, serving in that office until 1937. He was approached soon on in his mandate, he says by the end of his first week. He was approached at the headquarters at 68 Rue Notre Dame des Champs by a group of people who asked him to help them coordinate their activities, special meetings, study circles, lectures, etc. These people included people like Jacques-Henri Samaritain, Marc and Belle Chagall, and others. The groups met in one another's homes. They met at the House of the Fathers of Sion, and they focused on countering the anti-Semitism present in so many Christian circles by developing what they called a Christian response to, quote unquote, the Jewish question. That, the Jewish question, or the Jewish problem, and that's not my word, that was common discourse, was about the continued existence of the Jewish people in the face of what was called Jewish rejection of Jesus as Messiah. In 1928, De Vaux established La Question d'Israël, another way of framing the problem of Israel, a periodical seeking to forge bonds between Jews and Christians. In the attempt to combat anti-Semitism, it addressed to Christians articles providing information about such matters as the Jewish background of the New Testament and of Jesus, and on contemporary Judaism, the Judaism of the 1920s and 30s. The ambivalence here is startling, for the periodical presented anti-Semitism as antithetical to Christian ideals and as destroying hopes of converting Jews. To Jews, the periodical offered material on various aspects of Catholicism in the hope of attracting conversions. This appeared continued through the 1930s in a milieu of escalating anti-Semitism. People gathered, as I said, in various venues and became friends, became close friends. And as important as these meetings were, I think it is also necessary to remember that the ambivalence they represented, while a clear struggle against anti-Semitism, did not allow space for an acknowledgement that conversion of the Jews, in the massive sense, would mean erasure of the Jewish people. The women and men of Sion were part of the format of philosemitisme with all its ambivalence and with the possibilities for rethinking the relationships between Christians and Jews and between the two traditions. Ressourcement. The 1920s and 30s also saw the emergence of a new way of thinking about Christian, and specifically Roman Catholicism. It was ressourcement. What one author calls an internally diverse movement for renewal in the mid-20th century Catholic life and theology. People engaged in this work literally sought to return to the sources, understood as scriptures, the liturgy, the church fathers, and the other great witnesses to the tradition. This return to ancient sources joined the previous and ongoing turn to history and to Jewish sources for understanding Jesus, exemplified by the work of Joseph Bonservant, a Jesuit who pioneered among Christians in rediscovering the Second Temple Judaism and in rethinking the Jewish origins of Christianity, as well as in promoting friendship between contemporary Christians and Jews. Resistance to the Shoah. The experience of the Shoah was central to the development of new ways of thinking about Jews and Judaism among Christians, including Notre de Sion. With the invasions of the Nazis in 1940, France, Jews engaged in philo-Semitic circles found themselves in immediate danger. Some fled, others were hidden, and still others lost their lives. Many of the Christians who had been engaged in these circles and the theological and historical work that later became known as ressourcement became engaged in resistance and rescue. Involvement in resistance and rescue was not only political, it was personal, grounded in friendships that had matured over years of conversation and studies, and it was religious. Within a week of the invasion, the Nazis had shut down La Question d'Israël and the Library of the Fathers of Sion. Théomir de Vaux turned to organizing a network of people to collaborate in this work of rescue. Their team in Paris managed to hide approximately 600 children and 400 adults. Fathers of Sion in Belgium and Paris, and the more numerous sisters in Paris, Lyon, Marseille, Grenoble, and other French communities, as well as here in Rome and Antwerp, all were involved in hiding Jews, working in broader networks to provide hiding places, documents, including passports, baptismal certificates, ration cards, and the like, rations, and the wherewithal necessary for survival. The sisters in London received children from the Kindertransport. After the war, De Vaux founded Cahiers Sionien, Sion Notebooks. It's kind of an awkward, I don't know whether it's awkward or cute title, but at any rate, Cahiers Sionien. Paul Desman, Father Paul Desman of the Fathers of Sion, took over the direction of the periodical, which remained until its closure in 1955, a premier French-language scholarly journal, publishing articles on Judaism, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the relationship of Jewish and Christian tradition, the state of Israel. Authors included Jews and Christians, lay people and clergy, members of religious orders, and some of the members of the hierarchy, as well as some of the leaders of ressourcement, such as Jean Danielou. Some of these articles still manifested a supersessionist theology. However, the journal itself provided access to thinking and currents that would have advanced theological work in the years before and during World War II. Among the Fathers of Sion, Paul Desman's influence was greatest, both in relation to the Sion family, the Notre Dame de Sion family, as well as in the outside world. He was a founding member. He was at Seligsburg in 1947, where he met Jules Isaac. The two became close friends, and he was a founding member of the Amici Judéo-Chrétienne de France in 1948 in the wake of Seligsburg. Jules Isaac and Paul Desman would work together for years. Desman had been born into an assimilated Hungarian Jewish family and became a Christian as a small child. He joined the Order of Notre Dame de Sion in Belgium, and even during his seminary years perceived the tendency of anti-Judaism to quickly slide into anti-Semitism. It would take the sisters yet more time to take notice of Christian responsibility for anti-Semitism, despite the fact of genocide in their own work and rescue. I would like to say something now about subsequent developments. The currents of philosemitisme and ressourcement were evident in the chapter reports. A general chapter is a decision-making meeting held regularly, sometimes 4 years, every 5 years, every 6 years, depending on the congregation. It gathers together elected and ex officio delegates to make decisions for the next period of time. So in 1946, the Notre Dame de Sion held its first general chapter since the war. Its document reflects the motifs of ressourcement, and it's encouraging the sisters to spend time studying scripture and contemporary Judaism. The influence of ressourcement is also evident in the ways in which it is insistent on study. The report insists on the respect of the conscience of the children in Sion schools, and this will recur and recur and recur. The children and their parents are to be respected. Teaching sisters are to combat any anti-Semitism among the students. Jewish and Protestant children are not required to attend prayer, maintaining a long-standing tradition. There is one piece in here, in the chapter of 1951, 5 years later, that I want to highlight, because it is important to understand how far the journey was that we had to take. One of the pieces about the mission of the congregation speaks about reparation. Reparation was a theme that came into our thinking in the 1850s. And it stayed with us for a very long time. Reparation, which meant making amends for, quote, Jewish refusal to accept Jesus as Messiah and the perceived Jewish responsibility for Jesus' death. This document, however, it clarifies the expression accursed people, peuple maudit, saying that God has never cursed God's people. It also tackles, at least briefly, the motif of deicide, saying the charge of deicide is not true because those responsible by biblical authority did not understand what they were doing. The report cites the 1566 Catechism of the Council of Trent that states that the sins of all humanity are responsible for Jesus' death. However, ambivalence. It also emphasizes what it deems to be, quote, the gravity of Israel's, and again, quote, betrayal, and ascribes Israel's wandering, its existence as a separated people, to that betrayal. The document thus reinscribes traditional anti-Judaism / anti-Semitism. A few months later, the newly elected Superior General, Marie Félix, wrote a circular to all the superiors of the congregation. She alluded to that report, and she has something very important to say. It's also ambivalent, but it is important. She says, let us show to those outside the congregation that we work rather for a rapprochement, a coming together, a coming closer between Jews and Christians, rather than for premature conversions. A reputation for proselytism would damage our ministry more than serve it. She urges a path of rapprochement and of relationship following the influence of Paul de Man, and yet her thinking is still ambivalent in the manner of earlier philosemitism. She does not call into question the sisters' work for conversion, working with converts, or praying for the conversion of Jews. That would come later. Now, I'm going to say something about the Finali affair. The developing outreach to the Jewish community was interrupted and compromised. Oops. I can't say anything about the Finali affair. Thank you very much. I've run out of time. I will just say that, yes, we got involved in a very controversial and really tragic series of events called l'affaire Finali. That also provided a kind of impetus to push forward our transformation as a religious congregation. And that started immediately after the resolution of the Finali affair. And it's so much so that when it came time to drafting Nostra Aetate, Sisters of Sion were part of that, including one of the sisters who had been caught up in the Finali affair. And in some ways, this also, how shall I say, almost embodies both the ambivalence and the friendship, the motif of friendship that characterized the more than a century of development preceding our engagement in Nostra Aetate. Thank you very much.
The second speaker is Dr. Claire Maligot. The title of his speech is From Amici Israel to Nostra Aetate, Changes in the Theological Understanding and the Jewish People in the Catholic Church. Dr. Claire Maligot is a history student and currently high school teacher in France. She has written her dissertation in relations between Catholics and non-Christians from 1947 to 1965, from theology to diplomacy and activism. It has uncovered another history of Vatican II based on its non-Christian sources. Her historical inquiry was based on more than 90 archival collections spread in 8 different countries. I now invite Dr. Claire Maligot to present her topic.
Grazie davvero, grazie a tutti. Sono ancora dottoranda, non ancora dottoressa. Ringrazio tutti perché è davvero una grande gioia di essere scappata dalla vita ordinaria per stare parte del convegno e di queste bellissime discussioni. La relazione la farò in inglese comunque. For the sake of time, I've tended also to limit my my presentation to the notion of relations and faith relations throughout the pontificate of Pius XII. So the 1961 April report from the Secretary to Promote Christian Unity reads, Cardinal Bia outlines that a few Jews pretend that anti-Semitism draws on Catholic doctrine, which is false and needs to be corrected. Here was such a declaration that took place 8 months after the encounter between Jules Isaac and John the 23rd, and the affiliation of the Jewish draft to the Secretary to Promote Christian Unity, as well as the beginning of the drafting of several memoranda by the American Jewish Committee, by the Anti-Defamation League, and by the World Jewish Congress. This shows you the discrepancies that in the perceptions of what anti-Semitism was, how it has to be defined, and what were the role of Christian responsibilities in regard with it. What I want to point out in connection with what we have said during all these days of being together and discuss is the long-standing paradigm of the Catholic Church when it regards interfaith relations. So the long-standing paradigm for me was partly crystallized in the Pachellian era and not fully overcome in the early council years, as we have just seen. As we see here, it is difficult to draw a direct line from the Seligsburg moment of 1947 up to Nostra Aetate in 1965. In this paper, I will investigate the mindset, the habits, the practices, the institutional church system, and the culture that informed the reactions of individual actors of the Roman Curia at the Vatican receiving memorandums or correspondence from Jewish individuals or organizations. And what I will point out is the, to me, underlooked dimensions of canon law and doctrinal matters that actually framed the Vatican response. My thesis is the following. I think that when it comes to budding interfaith relations of the post-war era, Pius XII pontificate can be summarized to its long-yearned, for yet never occurred, condemnation of anti-Semitism, even in the post-war period. But it is also in the coherent policy on interfaith relations that has to be categorized under mistrust. In order to argue about such a big claim, I'm going to present 3 points. The first one is to insist on the role of the Holy Office ruling of 1950. The Holy Office at that time set the tone for the remaining Pachellian pontificate, distancing itself from the 1947 movement. Concerns about the Seligsburg Conference were raised from the start on. We know that from the Maritain's personal paper and correspondence when he was fearing that his position as French ambassador would be instrumentalized by the conference. But this is now backed up by a note from the Secretary of State advising against Maritain's presence at the Seligsburg conference because it was seen as inopportune. As we know also, Marie-Benoît de Bourdiré called in sick at the last minute. But again, archives help us to understand better the situation. In the archives of the Board of Jewish Deputies in Great Britain, a question mark was left around Marie-Benoît's name as early as late June because his presence was not secured yet. Last but not least, François Charrière, the Bishop of Fribourg, Lausanne, and Genève in Switzerland, declined its participation that he had early agreed on in early 1948, so to the next conference in Fribourg. And he, instead of coming, sent a message, a written message, just a couple of days after the monitum from the Holy Office was published, cum compertum, on ecumenical affairs. So my point here is to show you that concerns in the Vatican about Seligsberg were happening from the start on. Furthermore, the Pope that had several times, actually 4 times, received representatives of Jewish Christian organizations in the late 40s had managed to escape and dodge public endorsement about the Seligsberg thesis, offering instead personal blessings to his visitors and hosts, but not having that Wungian declaration against anti-Semitism that was asked by the people, as well as the implementation of such thesis. What is interesting to see is that public reports of Jewish Christian organizations that met the Pope were insisting on these blessings are gestures of approval, trying to make the most of what was a more nuanced approach to the audiences when you look into confidential report, internal confidential report to the organizations. Last but not least, the ICCJ, so the International Council of Christian Jews that had organized the Seligsberg conference, actually triggered a Holy Office inquiry starting as early as well as a request for information from the Secretary of State of the Vatican as early as July and October 1947. It was concluded by a set of cautionary measures in late October 1950. So let me come back to that big moment. Montini, as the substitute of the Secretary of State in late July 1947, sent a request for information to Bernardini, so the nuncio in Switzerland, and Sicogani is the apostolic delegate to the United States, to have information on the National Conference of Christian and Jews and its activities, as well as to the convening of the conference. Bernardini was happy to report and proud to report that no clergy, Catholic clergy that had been contacted by the organization had yet accepted to be part of the conference, again from the Vatican archives. And on his own side, Cicognani tried to instrumentalize such a request for information by having a larger inquiry about the activity of the National Conference of Christian and Jews that was seen through the eyes of intercreedal cooperation, so in continuity with the wartime ecumenism efforts that had already triggered some concerns in the United States. So Francis Cornell wrote also to Tordini in October 1947 asking the Pope to take action against the National Conference of Christian and Jews. This is to show you how difficult it was to think of relations at that time for the early post-war period within the Catholic Church. This inquiry then was set up to the Holy Office. Reports arrived from Fribourg. The Fribourg Conference of 1948 are now quoted in the ruling of 1950. And the storm was heading up, especially on the German Jewish Christian movement, explaining the visit of Gertrud Luckner and Kaltime to Leiber in Rome. My point with the confidential ruling of 1950 is to show you that to the Vatican what mattered more was doctrinal matter, the doctrinal matter of indifferentism, of relativism,
over the condemnation of anti-Semitism. And this was also implemented through disciplinary measures. I will now go to my second point, insisting, in order to further refine our narrative, that such decision was not just actually a Roman decision, byproduct of a Roman system that would crush innovation in peripheries. What I want to show you here is that it was actually embedded in the church system, enacted through canon laws, and endorsed and supported by local bishops that were made enforce such decision. The first point that needs to be made is to show the bishop compliance to such ruling. If you go back not here to the Vatican archives, but to the diocesan archives. So adhesion to that mindset was the largely common frame. We have seen Cicognani over compliance in the US. We could also quote that from other actors that we're seen are more prone to dialogue, more prone to interfaith relations than Cicognani himself. Let me take the case of Cushing, Archbishop Cushing, who was remembered as a great friend of the Jews. Due to the passing on of the ruling, even in a confidential way, by Cicognani to all American bishops, he withdrew his personal liaison to the Boston Jewish Council for Community Relations in the early January 1951. Griffith in London also filed reports after having left the British Council for Christian and Jews, filing reports that would go through the apostolic delegate to Great Britain and then to the Holy See on the activities of the Jewish Christian organization. And Jäger in Paderborn expressed some concerns directly to Luckner und Thieme, as was shown by Elias Füllenbach. The system of thought that was produced by that ruling and crystallized in those key years of 1947 to 1950 would continue on thanks to the stability of the Roman Curia and the development of curial careers. Again, let me take the case of Cicognani. As you know, the apostolic delegate to the US would come back to Rome, would become the head of the Central Preparatory Commission of Vatican II, and can largely be considered as the reason why the first draft of a Jewish decree was rebuked and put out of the agenda in June 1962. We can also show Tordini's consistency in terms of anti-Jewish prejudices, even though we have a slight evolution of Monsignor Dell'Acqua from what we've seen from the wartime era to the council years. At the same time, I would insist on the ecclesiological implication that was entailed into the 1950 ruling. The issue was who gets to do theology, because the ruling insisted that no well-known Catholics, and this was seen as targeting directly Maritain, could be part of the Jewish Christian organizations or form of dialogue with two organization names, so the ICCJ and the World Brotherhood. You had the issue of being in view, being well known, but you also had the issue of expertise and theological expertise. So in order to fight back the risk of indifferentism and relativism, Jewish-Christian relations would be more keenly seen as practiced by theologians themselves or clergy rather than lay people. And here, to me, this is the key of why it was so difficult for Jewish Christian organizations to really have a sphere of discussion at Vatican II, in the sense that if we look back at these Jewish Christian organizations, such as the ICCJ, they were mostly lay-led, with less clergy than in other organizations. They were grassroots movement, and they tended to be autonomous or to claim autonomy from ecclesiastical authority. Nonetheless, they were bilateral, so including Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. And here you understand why it was so important in terms of doctrine that the 1950 ruling of the Holy See was actually quoting the monitum against ecumenism and putting it on the bishops to actually enact such dispositions, continuing what had been defined by the 1917 canon law. So the long-standing effects on institutional norms can be seen throughout the rest of the pontificate. We shall not underestimate the force of such disciplinary measures. Let me take two cases. The first one is my hometown in France, Lyon. So Lyon had a local Jewish Christian organization since 1949. It was founded by a friend of Cardinal Gerlier, a lawyer himself. He was close to the Faculty of Theology of Lyon because he had a doctoral degree in theology, but he decided not to declare the local organization to Cardinal Gerlier, who became aware of the presence of such an organization only in 1957, when the National Conference would convene a meeting in Lyon. So here, Rodet had to call on Gerlier to ask for permission. And again, Gerlier would be really angry with his friend, saying, well, you are putting me in a position where I can't respect and make respect canon law. Another case that we can take is the London Society for Christian and Jews, where some Jesuits that would take part informally to discussions with Jews in 1958 would say that in order to remain for the situation to remain as fluid, quote unquote, as possible, they wouldn't ask for permission to be part of such discussions. The issue here was to bypass or to dodge the ruling that was reinforced by the Holy Office in the case of Great Britain in 1954. So the systems goes even beyond Pacelli if we look back at Bia's own stance. Bia scolded Hinan, so the new Westminster cardinal, in late 1961 and also in January 1962, saying that Hinan couldn't use the Secretary for Promoting Christian Unity to ask for the suppression of the ruling of the Holy Office that was forbidding the access to the British Council of Christian and Jews to Catholics. To Bia, this was a Holy Office matter, and the Council in no way would have to intervene within what remained the Holy Office. And here you have to remember, as was beautifully shown by both Michael Pfister and Sareta Marotta, the own Holy Office career of Cardinal Bia as a consultor at the Holy Office. It's only through Hinan's agency in 1964 that, because the Holy Office, contacted again by Hinan, didn't respond to his letter, that he took it upon himself to allow and authorize Catholics to come back to the British Council of Christian and Jews, that we had a reintegration of Catholics in that specific national case. What I want also to add is that you still have a form of weaponization of the 1950 ruling at the local level. So let me here take the case of Cincinnati. In November and December 1955, so just a couple of weeks after Nostra Aetate had been voted on by the council, the bishop, Karl Alter, made reference to the ruling of the Holy Office, the previous ruling of the Holy Office, to forbid two of his priests to be part of interfaith reunions, meetings that would happen with the Jewish Reform movement in Cincinnati. one of them taking place in a church. So as you see, it was even before, even after the declaration was voted on, and it still remained enacted or active at a local level. So this is my final remark. We have a form of triple track diplomacy and theology. We have the local autonomous discussion of Jewish Christian organizations. We also have the side-tracking of Jewish Christian organization at Rome at the time of the council, and that is the reason why I think that the Secretary for Promoting Christian Unity tended to rely more on the efforts of Catholic institutions rather than on Jewish memorandas or on the claims from Jewish Christian organizations in their first drafts of Nostra Aetate. And here the point is that Apeldoorn as well as Sedenhall are the two references that you find in the early draft and not Seligsberg. So in order to conclude, I think that the point of theological tensions are the difficulty to acknowledge from the Vatican side the Christian roots of anti-Semitism. And here we can find back what was Pius XI's stance in the fact that if anti-Semitism was anti-Christian, then anti-Semitism was only an individual and moral problem of lapsed Christian, but the issue of confronting structural anti-Semitism was still really hard for the Vatican circles. So I also think that it's because the doctrinal and disciplinary frame was so strong that it's actually through the door of liturgical reform, of liturgical translation, that reform was able to happen under Pius XII with the priors of the Good Friday. I thank you for your attention.
In the third and the last speaker is Rabbi David Maayan. The title of his talk is Self-Understanding and Understanding the Author, Nostra Aetate, and Theology of Dialogue. David Maayan is the Maayan and Douglas Kohn Chair in Jewish Thought Institute, Director of the Center of Catholic Jewish Studies at St. Leo University. An Orthodox rabbi, he teaches about Judaism and other religions and philosophies. He is focused on Jewish mysticism and Hasidism in comparison with Christian theology and in the context of modernity. David Maayan explores the possibilities and challenges of interreligious friendship between Christians and Jews. Rabbi David Maayan, please present your topic.
Thank you, and I would like to thank the organizers of the conference. Modern Catholic Jewish dialogue makes extraordinary demands of its participants. This process is one which, if fully engaged in with the proper spirit, is rooted in deep truths, both psychological and theological. It has great transformational potential. I, like many Jewish participants and observers, am wary of terms such as reconciliation and healing, if the latter means closure and resolving an issue rather than an ongoing therapeutic process. Yet the religious terminology of metanoia or tshuva, repentance, with all of their theological associations and their respective traditions, may be justly invoked. These terms are warranted in considering the best aspects of what has already occurred by the processes of study, reflection, encounter, and dialogue that have flourished, at least at times, for some individuals and some communities, since the planting of the seed for a renewed relationship in Nostra Aetate 4. There is a crucial and hard-earned insight into what makes a true encounter, and thus also a genuinely transformational one between Jews and Catholics possible. This is the willingness to recognize the alterity of one's dialogue partner, that the other has an inner life and a self-understanding. When this is lacking, the process of understanding the other is in fact an attempt to assimilate the other into the limits of my own understanding. When I am aware that the other possesses self-understanding, I rather seek to enter the presence of the other and hope for some disclosure and insight from the other. This fundamental insight was articulated early and often in Catholic documents of the encounter. Many persons, Catholics, Jews, and others, are my inspiration and teachers here, both verbally and through their lived examples. Nonetheless, I feel that there is a need to hold this up and stress its implications, since there are many obstacles, psychological, historical, and political, to its realization in practice. After briefly reviewing the principle in Catholic reflections on the dialogue, I will highlight the value of the recognition of alterity by a reflection on the use of Jews and Judaism historically in Christian self-understanding. I will argue that the subject of the Holocaust, in particular, demands a conscious emphasis on the recognition of alterity. Finally, I will claim that this process, while challenging, is not only valuable, but also potentially a source of delight that is uniquely nourishing. Nostra Aetate 4 largely defines Jews in relation to Christianity. This is also reflected in the structure of Nostra Aetate as a whole, which appears to proceed through concentric circles, noting aspects of unity and connection that the Church finds in relation to all human beings, and then in relations to great religious traditions such as Hinduism and Buddhism, and then with the more similar tradition of Islam. When the text comes to the Jewish people, their closeness to Christianity is reflected in the fact that they appear in the document as a result of internal Christian reflection. Quote, "As the Sacred Synod searches into the mystery of the Church, it remembers the bond that spiritually ties the people of the New Covenant to Abraham's stock," unquote. As Pope John Paul II commented in his 1987 address to Jewish representatives in Argentina, this shows the, quote, "closeness of our respective religions, united by what the Council calls precisely a spiritual bond," unquote. The year before, in his speech in the Great Synagogue of Rome, and in relation to these same opening words of Nostra Aetate 4, the Pope had stated, quote, "The Jewish religion is not extrinsic to us, but in a certain way is intrinsic to our own religion," unquote. One of the most striking aspects of the Catholic Church's reorienting relationship to and dialogue with Jews and Judaism is that it is presented as an essential process for the sake of the Church's own self-understanding. This aspect is also reflected in the history of the document, which had at one stage been intended as a chapter in the Decree on Ecumenism. Monsignor John Osterreicher, in his account of the genesis of Nostra Aetate, records the words of several theologians, himself included, who justified this structure. Here are the words of Bernard Lambert, OP, which I find both felicitous and provocative, on Israel as an ecumenical problem. Quote, "Judaism remains outside the Church, yet it never ceases to act on and in the Church. It acts in the Church through the Jewish origins of Christianity. It acts on the Church in virtue of a kind of destined solidarity that brings Jews and Christians together at all the great crossroads of history. The Jew cannot lose sight of the Christian cannot ignore the Jew. Something unique brings us together and yet separates us, as if neither of us can quite pass the other. The relations between us are governed by an odd alternation of rejection and acceptance. The problem of Israel is not extra-ecumenical," end quote. 4 elements stand out to me in this quote. Firstly, Judaism is construed as an actor on and in the Church, and not merely as a kind of raw material or background. Secondly, this active role is not confined to the matter of the Jewish origins of Christianity, an element emphasized in Nostra Aetate, but is seen as unceasing and recurring throughout history. Thirdly, there is a presumed parallel in the formulation that neither the Jew nor the Christian could ignore the other. Finally, there is the double negative phrasing resorted to by many thinkers here. The problem of Israel is not extra-ecumenical. This phrasing highlights the unique dynamic of the Church's relationship to Jews and Judaism, which is somehow felt to be of the self, for it is not internal, and yet also the ultimate other. in the sense that it is outside the usual category of outside. Jews are other than other. Whatever the limitations of Nostra Aetate, its full-throated endorsement of the process of dialogue opened vast future possibilities. Already, the 1974 Guidelines and Suggestions for Implementing the Conciliar Declaration Nostra Aetate 4 emphasizes the need to seek to engage Jewish self-understanding. That document expresses the hope, quote, for a better knowledge on the part of Christians of the essence of the religious traditions of Judaism and of the manner in which Jews identify themselves, unquote. Also, quote, Christians must strive to learn by what essential traits the Jews define themselves in light of their own religious experience, end quote. Modern Catholic-Jewish relations engages in the study of and encounter with Jews and Judaism as a source for Christian self-understanding. Not only for this purpose, but emphatically also for this purpose. What is crucial about the ideal expressed in documents like Guidelines is the stated conviction that this process must involve sincere engagement with living Jews' self-understanding. As Philip Cunningham has put it, ignorance of Jewish self-understanding will result in a distorted understanding of Christianity, unquote. This contrasts with so much history, not that this is relegated to the past, in which Jews and Judaism were a source for the construction of Christian self-understanding, but only rhetorical Jews and Judaism, or what Jeremy Cohen has studied as the hermeneutic Jew. In fact, the use of the hermeneutic Jew never actually resulted in Christian self-understanding in the sense of providing genuine insight and disclosure of the depths of the self, but rather what I would term the construction of a Christian self-image. For such purposes, the real personhood and inner life, and most crucially, the self-understanding of actual Jews is immaterial. In fact, it is an obstacle. The engagement with Jews and Judaism for Christian self-understanding must be the engagement with Jewish self-understanding. But the construction of an image for the self as a Christian is served most easily by the construction of an image for the Jew. This image does not have to be a study in absolute contrast. What is important for this process is that the image of the Jew should exist only relative to the central concern, the image of the Christian to be constructed, and thus should fall into clear categories, either as a symbol of the self to be claimed, assimilated into the self, or as a symbol of the self's opposite to be easily and sharply defined as outside, eliminated from the self. In either case, the goal is to bring into clear definition an image of the self. The Jewish other is thus instrumentalized purely for the sake of construction of a self-image. What this instrumentalized use of the hermeneutic Jewish other lacks is the psychological and existential dimension of a kind of protracted pause. That is, a moment in which one is taken aback, filled with an awareness of the otherness of the other. I do not simply mean difference. Difference is constantly evoked in the image process and integral to it, but rather the actual alterity of another person. We are taken aback in encountering alterity, not because the other is, in fact, the opposite of the self, but rather precisely because the other is, just like oneself, also a person. The other is not an object, but also a subject with a self-identifying center who can only be encountered across the gap between two persons by the self-revelation of the other, which always also communicates the fact of its mystery. When one is taken aback by alterity, one recognizes in that moment, to some extent, that the other is not simply raw material for the creation of oneself. The other's real inner life, unlike an image I construct of the other, is never fully known to me, is inexhaustible, is a mystery. This recognition of the other's self and inner life as mystery creates a moment of potential insight and growth in my own self-understanding. A sense of the mystery of the self begins to seep past my fixed self-image. Perhaps the rigid image of the self was, in fact, constructed precisely to act as a kind of dam, preventing a flooding awareness of this mystery. And further, what I am referring to now as the mystery of self can open onto the mystery of being itself, an expanded awareness of being in the presence of God. In his influential study of the medieval Christian use of the hermeneutic Jew, Jeremy Cohen explores a series of ironic and complex consequences that flowed from the construct of the Jews as, quote, living letters of the law, end quote. This was the famous notion that the Jews, as a representation of and witness to the Old Testament, had a role to play in Christendom as verifying the faith and life of the church. The Christian discovery of the Talmud in the Latin West, beginning in earnest in the 13th century, led many Christian thinkers to lament that living Jews seemed, in fact, to have been turned aside from Scripture by religious tradition. In effect, having declared the Jews living letters of the law, some Christians were dismayed to discover just how living they were, for they were not only reciting the Torah, but also continuing to interpret Torah and their own religious and historical experiences in ever-expanding ways that were quite distinct from those of Christianity. It is crucial to recognize that it was not only the differences, but also the similarities that disturbed some Christians. Christians frequently imagined the Jewish manner of the interpretation of Scripture as limited to the literal, for example. To discover Jewish readings that were associative, allegorical, spiritual, and all the rest was disturbing to some, precisely because it revealed not the Jew as other, but the Jew as an other self who engages in activities that seem parallel to, yet also profoundly distinct from, those that I and others in my tradition engage in. A great gift of contemporary Jewish Catholic dialogue is that it can promote conditions in which we can encounter living letters of the law who can talk back when they feel that you have misinterpreted them. If only the letters of Scripture could raise objections and ask questions of our interpretations and constantly remind us that their depths have not been plumbed. While a robust scriptural hermeneutics attempts to enable such an approach to study, it is a gift of dialogue that the other is there to insist on their existence as a subject and not merely an object, to free us from myopic self-centeredness. I do not propose that either Jews or Christians should see their dialogue partners as having the status of Scripture, or more absurdly, of God. Yet the acknowledgement that there is theological significance to the other, and of the potential for dialogue to be a locus of a type of revelation, means that our study of Scripture and even our experience of our relationship with God may be affected and enhanced by such encounters. So, to my mind, all of these reflections have everything to do with the Holocaust. This is because to speak now of how Jews, quote, define themselves in light of their own religious experience must include in the light or shadow of the Holocaust. While it is problematic for the Holocaust or anti-Semitism to define Jewish identity, it also cannot fail to inflect self-understanding. This is also true theologically. This is because the Jewish people and their lived existential situations are not only addressed by Jewish theology, but are also part of its data. Now, there is no single Jewish self-understanding, and there is certainly no single Jewish understanding of the Holocaust. Even for the same individual Jew, it often refuses to exist as a stable category, which is also part of the phenomenon of trauma. Nonetheless, the Holocaust, meaning here also the survivors and their descendants, memories, images, all the ongoing effects of the Shoah, inflects every element of Jewish self-understanding. Central to this is the sense of the unspeakable or incommunicable, a sense of silence bereft of theological answers, as well as an awareness of doubt, trauma, and brokenness among Jews of all types. It is one of the ironies of the modern developments in Jewish Catholic relations that the Catholic Church, in part in response to the Holocaust, began to issue forth an increasing clarion call about the irrevocable divine gifts, ongoing eternal covenant, and belovedness of the Jews to God in a manner that is foreign to most Jews, in part in the shadow of the Holocaust. As Alan Brill has put it, in the post-Holocaust context, quote, few Jews evoke the eternal covenants as a comfort, end quote. Certainly, plenty of contemporary Jews affirm the principle of an eternal covenant and Jewish chosenness, but there are few Jews whose affirmation of Israel as beloved and partaking in a special relationship with God is not also deeply informed by pathos, even a certain irony. I am speaking of a gap here not of the knowledge of facts, but of existential stance. Perhaps the gap here is most poignantly encountered in Christological interpretations of Jewish suffering in the Holocaust. As Karma ben Yochanan notes, for some Christian authors, quote, the similarity between Auschwitz and the crucifixion was conceived as almost self-evident, end quote. This was perhaps particularly true of Christians who in fact had warm feelings about Israel. She proceeds to quote Clemens Thomas, quote, a believing Christian should not find it so very difficult to interpret the sacrifice of the Jews during the Nazi terror. His thoughts should be turned toward Christ, to whom these Jewish masses became alike in sorrow and death. Auschwitz is the most monumental sign of our time for the intimate bond and unity between the Jewish martyrs, who stand for all Jews, and the crucified Christ, even though the Jews in question could not be aware of it, unquote. Note the author's declaration of the lack of difficulty in this interpretation. But notice, too, the explicit remark that this clear interpretation is true, even though the Jews in question could not be aware of it. This not-so-difficult interpretation is, indeed must be, occluded from Jews' own self-awareness. I would highlight the link here between the ease of this interpretation and the irrelevance of Jewish self-understanding for it. Such Christological interpretations of the Holocaust, particularly of Jewish suffering as redemptive or revelatory, are generally abhorred by Jews. As part of the dialogue, such objections and reactions must be shared and listened to. At the same time, as a Jewish participant in the dialogue, I need to practice listening generously here and experiencing alterity. A Christological interpretation of the Holocaust may be a sincere attempt to contemplate it, and by bringing Jews and their experiences into the heart of one's own devotional imagination, a way of making room for the other in the very heart of one's faith, listening closely and sincerely to such Christian reflections may make possible an increased understanding both of the other and of oneself. The fruits of the process of Catholic-Jewish encounter have convinced me that the process of being taken aback by the other, of pausing before the reality of the other, is a crucial ongoing component of true dialogue. To some extent, this practice is a discipline, and there is no doubt that at times it can feel both unnatural and frankly uncomfortable. However, there is also a very real dimension of joy and delight in this practice of recognizing alterity. Recognizing the other is uncomfortable because the other's lived reality may not fit into one's world. But for just that reason, it presents an invaluable opportunity to be freed from the narrowness and indeed distortions of one's own self-world, to truly touch a reality beyond the self's constructions. This is, in the literal sense of the word, an ecstatic experience. The self is freed from an artificially imposed static state and can potentially be both surprised and delighted by the genuinely new. There is a necessary moment of stumbling in this constant walk approaching the other, when the smoothness of my step is interrupted. This is the result of repeated acts of realization that the reality of the other continually surpasses my preconceived image. In thinking of stumbling, it is only natural to worry about the possibility of injury. But we also speak about having stumbled across something of remarkable beauty, a source of surprising delight, that we could not, by definition, have pre-planned because its existence was not in our awareness before. In closing, I would like to make a brief remark on Paul's reflections on Israel in Romans 9-11. This is the central New Testament text for many of the most important affirmations of Nostra Aetate 4. In particular, following Paul's description in Romans 11, the Synod declared of the church, quote, "Nor can she forget that she draws sustenance from the root of that well-cultivated olive tree onto which have been grafted the wild shoots, the Gentiles," end quote. Seeing that the branch is thus able to be nourished by the tree, some have commented that this shows that the tree of Israel is not other than the grafted branch. Nostra Aetate's construal of Israel as a source of nourishment for the church is ambiguous. Which Judaism, which Jews, could be a part of this process? Nostra Aetate's exegesis, perhaps wisely, does not mention the broken-off branches in Paul's discussion. Many who have gone deeply into the Catholic-Jewish dialogue are convinced that the mystery of Israel Paul speaks of need not be relegated only to eschatology, but can also provide an opening onto the mysterious ways that nourishment can be found in the process of encounter in the here and now. The assumption that nourishment comes only from the same or the similar must be challenged. It is possible to be positively nourished by alterity, And I believe that Paul, in his emphasis on the need to avoid arrogance, in his exhortation to tremble, is invoking the power of the realization of alterity as a source of correct Christian self-understanding. A final thought drawing on rabbinic tradition. Proverbs 31 sings the praises of the woman of valor, sometimes read in rabbinic exegesis as a type of the people of Israel. Verse 14 states, Mimerchach tavi lachma, she brings her nourishment from afar. Rabbi Nehemiah is quoted in the Palestinian Talmud as interpreting, she brings her nourishment from afar. Words of Torah are poor in their place and rich in another place. This means sometimes the apparent headquarters for a topic in Torah is, in fact, lacking in many or important details about that very topic. The interpreter must be willing to go afar, elsewhere in the Bible, to find the riches which will illuminate that original place. Rabbi Nehemiah's intention was to comment on the Torah and perhaps also on patterns of rabbinic thought in engaging with Torah. Yet this same exploratory hermeneutic, recognizing that nourishment may not come only from the near at hand or the close, but also from afar, should also, by analogy, inform our interreligious engagements, particularly in the infinitely promising, always challenging process of Catholic-Jewish relations. Thank you very much.